don't even know. When did you take over, Joe? Was it 2018? Something like that?
Yeah, we had one at UIC, and then we had one set up in 2020, and then
COVID came and all that,
yeah.
so it's good. Yeah, I've been doing it a long time. I'm somewhat of a dinosaur. They tell me I'm old school now, but I don't know that I'm really old school, because old school to me are the older guys that I looked up to when I was coming through my profession. But I am older, that's for sure. So, training speed-specific eccentric actions for the preparation of athletes. We'll be talking about that today. I'm going to be doing something a little different today. You probably heard a commercial that says, we don't make the products you use, we make the products you use better. Have you heard that? It's an old one. I'm giving away my age here. It might have been in the 80s. Anyway, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not bringing something to you that is just so new and so creative that you're going to have this big epiphany. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some things that you probably already know, and I'm going to break them down, and I'm going to put a little different twist on them, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to think a little differently about maybe why you do some things that you do, and a little different take about utilizing some things you do in a different way to get your athletes specific adaptations that you're looking to get out of them to improve their performance. I do want to shout out to Joel Chapman. Being an Illinois State Director is a thankless job. And a lot of hours go into putting on clinics like this, and you need other people to help, and it just takes a lot to put this on. So let's give a shout out and a clap to Joel. It's not easy doing it. Joel, wherever you are, thank you. All right, well, we'll hop right in here. Hopefully this technology will work for me. I do want to introduce a few people that are going to be presenting with me. I have some of my great employees here. We have Neo, Amanda, and Malia. They're going to be helping me out today, taking a few of the slides, and they're going to be contributing too. So we're all here. We came up from Charleston last night, and we're ready to rock and roll. So you guys ready? Yeah. All right. And by the way, I don't want to just get up here and lecture. If you guys have questions, or you want to stop me on a certain point and say, hey, why are you doing that, or whatever, let's make this interactive so I'm just not preaching at you guys. All right, because I think there's a lot to be learned by getting interaction from the people in the crowd. So, and you might have something to contribute to, and I might learn something today too. So will everyone else. So don't hold back, okay? Just let me know that you want to contribute. All right. So, I'm hearing noises. Maybe you're going to have to do this manually. All right, eccentric muscle action. Definition of eccentric muscle action. Just keep me going here. All right, muscle fibers lengthen under tension. Okay, sometimes it used to be called in the old days eccentric contraction. They're calling it action now. The muscle lengthens. These are some examples. Downward movement of a barbell, the landing phase of a jump. Everybody probably heard the term eccentric. Okay, you know what it is. Keep going. All right, muscles produce force. They produce them whether the muscle shortening or lengthening. All right, eccentric actions, they don't reduce muscular force, but they do absorb energy. All right, and that's very important when we're talking about athletic performance. Muscle lengthens while under tension, and got a little visual there. Why train eccentric actions? Okay? They occur naturally in sport. They occur naturally in sport. They occur naturally with the activities of daily living. All right? They develop physical qualities necessary for high levels of athletic performance. If you're not training and you're not actually dedicating a certain block of your training to specifically working on eccentric actions in particular, and part of your training cycle, I think you're missing out, because there's some things that you can be doing, especially in regards to fast eccentric training. We always think of eccentric training typically as slow, and we're going to go through all that, but we're going to talk a lot about fast eccentric training, which sometimes you might think it's contradictory. Okay? Movement. What makes a good athlete a good athlete? Efficient movement. Who can move better? Sometimes it's all about producing force, There's a lot of athletes that can produce a tremendous amount of force. It doesn't mean it's going to transfer always onto the field in a way that you want, especially when you're talking about very sport-specific movements. You have to have both. All right, so what are some of the things that happen with chronic eccentric training? This is just a flow chart. You can go through these high muscle forces. We can use a lot of muscle force doing eccentric actions. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about percentages. Absorption of energy, stiffer muscle spring, sports performance. You've heard us talk about a spring in your step, reactive strength, okay? Those are very specific adaptations that occur. That can be bolstered by doing fast eccentric training. Everybody's heard of plyometrics, okay? Stretch shortening cycle, okay? Eccentric action is a component of that stretch shortening cycle. Also, with high muscle forces, what do we get? Tom, you and I were talking about, you generate big force, okay? One of the side effects of that is hypertrophy, increased muscle size, all right? From a rehab standpoint, it's got a very low metabolic requirement. It's not very calorically expensive, doesn't take a lot, so some people can't necessarily do a concentric action due to injury, but they can do an eccentric action as the muscle yields to the force rather than overcomes the force and contracts and shortens. Okay, Neil? All right, slow or fast. And like I said, we don't make the things you use, we make the things you use better. Most people don't think of fast eccentric actions. They don't think of them as fast. We think of heavy, slow movements. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a place for that. But there's also a place for fast eccentric actions. And one of my favorite childhood stories, the tortoise and the hare, kind of using that. So slow or fast. Two different methods for doing eccentric training. All right. So we have a video here. This is just body weight exercises. This is nothing earth-shattering, but we do want to play the videos. On the left side, you see Amanda eccentrically moving into a full range of motion squat. You see Malia jumping into a split squat stance and doing what we call a lunge drop. Much faster, but still under control. All right, one is slow, one is fast. Now these are just body weight exercises. They're unloaded. All right, a lot of the studies out there that talk about and study eccentric actions, they use isokinetic machines which controls velocity. Okay, they're done with tension, but the speed is controlled. Most of the studies, that's what we find out there. Now, everybody should probably, through their experience, understand that you have greater eccentric strength than you have concentric strength. And I'm going to give you some specific examples, okay? A muscle can yield to a force, okay? For example, the lowering of a bar and a bench to a much heavier load than it can concentrically overcome the force, press the bar away from the body. And that's an important concept what we're going to talk about when we get into fast eccentric actions. All right? So research clearly demonstrates the benefits, okay, of slow training. It does. There's less research out there on fast eccentric training. So what you're going to get today is you're going to get a culmination of over 40 years of my experience in the field, and I'm going to extrapolate from what we already know in the science. Okay, and I was telling my staff last night about bridging the gap between what we do as practitioners and what the science tells us. Studies are great. I read them all the time. But what can we take from those studies and extrapolate and put them into real life and use them with our athletes and our clients to make them better? So even though there's not a lot of research on the fast eccentrics, if we talk about just the principle of specificity, it makes sense that if sport occurs at high speeds, and with high speeds you also are dealing with high forces, then we probably should do some high force, high speed, eccentric training. And there's not a lot of research on that. And so when I get to the part where I'm talking about the fast eccentric training, I'm going to talk about some things and some training that you probably already do and you're very familiar with, but it's going to have a little different twist. All right, this is some egghead stuff here. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but when you do high volume eccentric training, you can't damage the muscle, and you can damage the muscle negatively, okay? And there's some consequences if you have developmental athletes or youth athletes. You have to be very careful because a lot of them have not developed a lot of neuromuscular control. So you start, if we just take the overload principle, you start overloading somebody, okay, or loading somebody externally and have them moving real fast, and they don't have good neuromuscular control. It's almost a soft tissue injury in the weight. We know that as practitioners. So these are just some of the things. I won't go through all of them. Go ahead, Leo. That happen, it can happen with high volume eccentric training. Go ahead. But notice, novice lifters or exerciser athletes, they may have a tension limiting neural mechanism within their body, which means they're not capable of handling those shear forces and those loads. So when I get to the point of showing you some of the high speed, loaded, fast eccentric exercises, just keep that in mind, because I know sometimes we get excited when we learn a few things, and we're always thinking in our minds as practitioners, how can I take this and go back with it? And I may give you some nuggets that you identify with and you want to take them back. But if you're working with 8 and 9-year-olds, just keep in mind, use common sense. We can't be loading them. Okay, they still can work fast, but we can't be loading them. Methods should be based on needs and training goals. Okay, I don't have to spend much time on this, but you know what your athletes need. And you can test. You can test for eccentric capabilities too. But what are the training goals? What are the needs? One of the things that happens with eccentric training is that a lot of mechanical work happens over a greater amount of time, especially with slow eccentric training. What does that produce? A lot of what? Delayed onset muscle soreness, right? So this is not something, you know, the application of eccentric training you should do in the middle of a sports season, right? We would save that for another part of the training cycle when adaptation is occurring, when they have more rest and recovery time. So just common sense. Specificity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but why do we need fast eccentric training? Look at the external rotation on that. I mean, that's a case for why we need strength and conditioning in general, right? Okay? 3 reasons why we need fast. Number 1, specificity. I already said about how sport movements occur quickly. The eccentric movements in sports occur quickly, and if we're going to take specificity, okay, that principle, it only makes sense if we extrapolate from the slow studies. Why aren't we doing them fast? We should be doing them. And I know there's some training systems out there, they don't believe in specificity. I'm just going to tell you from practicing over 40 years, everybody should know what the said principle is, okay? Specific adaptations to imposed demands. And I'm not talking down to anyone here, I promise. I'm just throwing this out there for a refresher. There are specific adaptations that occur, very specific ones, because you get what you train for. And if you're too much of a generalist, you're not going to get these adaptations. So you have to be more specific, especially when we get into the fast eccentric training. Another reason is injury prevention. Sport movements occur at high speeds. So if we're always training slow, we're not really training the body to eccentrically control at higher speeds. And then the last, movement efficiency. Everything we do all comes down to how well they're going to be able to plug in all the adaptations that we've helped create in their bodies and move correctly so that they can perform their sports, no matter what that sport is. All right, specificity. Like I just said, most velocities on the field, they involve high forces. A lot of them are closed chain movements. Classic example is American football. I mean, you got a running back here who's charging, and it looks like a defensive back who's trying to stop him. Okay, you got the unstoppable force hitting the immovable object, so to speak. If you notice the joint angles that are occurring here, I mean, he's pretty low there, okay? So I'm going to use this term, and it's not a common term, and maybe you've heard it before, but I'm going to use the term disadvantageous joint range of motion. Has anyone heard about that? Okay? Disadvantageous joint ranges of motion. First of all, my old friend Lawrence Seeger, he always says, joint angles dictate muscle recruitment. Okay? How many of you high school coaches, they have the signs on the walls, our kids squat 500, okay? Well, yeah, I can squat 500 pounds like that too, pretty easily. Okay, you're in the advantageous joint range of motion. So an advantageous joint range of motion is the athletic position. Slight flexion of the hips and knees. From these joint angles, I can move forward, laterally, vertically. I can move in almost any direction. If I had you stand up like this, or if you had your athletes stand up, you said, move as quick as you can laterally to the right, they'd automatically drop down and do this. Why? Because they go into a favorable joint range of motion to produce muscular force. A very unfavorable or disadvantageous place to create muscular force is when you significantly move through the full range of motion. Okay? If you've seen an Olympic weightlifter squat and they squat full range of motion, rock bottom squats, you are a lot weaker, okay, at the bottom position than you are at the top position because of joint angles and muscle recruitment. It's just the way it is. And so if we're talking about fast eccentric training, we have to take into account the joint angles that we're utilizing. Joint angles are very important. And we realize that we need movement, speed, and control through these joint ranges of motion because if you look at injuries, a lot of injuries occur during the eccentric actions of sporting movements. A lot of them occur. Going up for a rebound, coming down and landing, for example. All right? This defensive back trying to stop someone moving at him at very high velocities and rates of speed. Something's going to happen. The muscle's going to have to give. It's going to absorb some of that energy, and he's going to have to, impart energy to that guy and take him down. So here's just an example. If you watch this video, I kind of like the kind of karate kicks the guy, which probably isn't good, but notice he's going up, got this concentric action, followed by a landing on one leg, and then a change of direction, making a sporting movement. Now look at that. Look at how high he is. Look at how high he gets. Look at how high he's coming down, and he lands on one leg. That takes a lot of eccentric control and strength to be able to do that without blowing out your knee, okay? He also gets a little extra MMA move in there. But that takes a lot of stability, control, and eccentric strength to do that, okay? To dampen landing forces, to temper the knee forces, and like I said earlier, joint injuries are more likely to occur on the landing phase. Okay, another reason, movement efficiency, all right? Maintaining good posture and lower body mechanics, okay, when you land, all right? Stability and control within an established base of support. Bases of support and stances change often in sports. So it's important to be able to change from one stance to another and be able to control that base of support. That's the difference sometimes between making the play or preventing an injury. And then developing efficient motor patterns. That's very important because those carry directly over into sporting movements. We have to develop the efficient motor patterns. All right? Like I said earlier, just to emphasize, younger athletes, many times they lack the neural ability to be able to control these fast actions. Just keep that in mind if you're working with younger kids, younger athletes. All right, why slow eccentric training? There's tons of studies out there of the advantages of slow eccentric training. By the way, my stand, can you guys see this? I'm sorry if I'm blocking. Strength, injury prevention, and hypertrophy. So we'll go through all three of these. So strength, if we take the overload principle, okay, you can load 130% of a concentric 1 rep max eccentrically. Meaning if you could bench press 100 pounds, you could load 130 on the bar and perform the action eccentrically. You might not be able to overcome the weight and press it back up concentrically, but you can eccentrically load up to 130%. That number comes from some studies. Probably safe, pretty safe if you have some training mileage on your car there. And you have to, you would do 130% with a novice lifter. But it's a great stimulus to use the overload principle for strength. Because what do you have to do? Tom, we were talking about earlier. If you want to get stronger, what do you have to do? You have to generate big force, right? Well, if you're like me, and this is just an observation I've made over the years, off seasons almost don't exist anymore for athletes. I mean, you got kids playing ball all year long in their sports, which I guess here's where I am old school. When I was going to school when I was younger, we had a school season, that was it. There was no AAU, there was no parents having clubs and going out. You know, I got kids coming in that are pitching 100 games over the summer in baseball, and they're 14. It's nuts. There's no time for rest recovery, and then dad brings them in, or mom, and says, well, we want to get him stronger, man. He needs to squat heavy and do this and this, and I'm thinking, the kid can't lift up his arm. He's so sore. So if I just do restoration techniques with the kid, he gets better, and that's why I say, parents, you can't stay. This is, you can't do it. This is my domain. There's only one coach here, besides me and some people who work for me. You know, there's only room for one lion here, male lion, that's it. Because we're getting advice from, and you guys know how the story goes. But it's very important to understand that it's all rest and recovery now. So if you have a shortened off season, and these kids finally get into college and you get a D1 scholarship, they got spring ball and all this, and you have to get them strong, and you need to generate big forces fairly quickly, and provided they have the recovery period, slow eccentrics is a really good way to do that, because soreness is really not going to play a big part because they're not playing the sport at that time. So you have to use it judicially, but the main thing is that 130%. That's going to come into play when I start showing you the fast eccentric techniques and some of the exercises. Here's another example, injury prevention. So one of the things we do, Eric could probably relate to this. So there's my new legend rack, by the way, Eric and Tom. We put some bands on there because as the lifter descends into the disadvantageous joint range of motion, where joint angles are changing way down at the bottom, we want to have a little safety there too, because he's doing just heavy eccentrics. We just keep loading weight on the bar, keeps dropping down. So you can use common sense. You can unload a little bit at the bottom, depending on what percentage of 1 RM you're using, or what percentage over 1 RM you're using. But one of the things that happens, and this is even something that if you do personal training and you have a client that comes in and let's say they have osteoporosis or osteopenia, you can use some techniques like this to overload them in a safe manner. Some of the structural adaptations you can get from this is increased tensile strength of the connective tissue. That's a good thing you get from heavy eccentric loading. And connective tissue takes longer to adapt than muscle. You probably heard that or read that in a study or heard that in the book. It takes longer to do that. And so really having a plan to increase the connective tissue of your athletes, especially if you're going to go into a part of the cycle that's heavy. And so, slow eccentrics can help you do that. You just have to be smart about it. And then bone density, reaching minimal essential strain. I had a conversation with a professor at the University, Eastern Illinois University several years ago, my alma mater, and we were talking about how do we increase bone density, and they were doing a study where they set up a circuit, and they had women going through the circuit, and I say women because the study involved all women test subjects, and they wanted to increase bone density, and I said, well, are you hitting MES? And she says, well, how do I know? I said, well, what exercises are you doing? And they were doing mostly single joint circuit exercises, which you really can't load that heavy on there. Obviously, multi-joint exercises like squatting and things like that. And so I said, you got to change up what you're doing, and you have to be real prudent about it and whatnot. So that's where kind of the use of the bands comes in, things like that. But you can. It's an easy way to increase the tensile strength of the connective tissue, and also you can reach minimal essential strain pretty easy using heavy, slow eccentrics. Also, hypertrophy training, all right? And so I'm not talking about bodybuilding here, but this is more in a rehabilitation, prehabilitation kind of way. You can see Amanda there is just doing an eccentric external rotation on the cable machine. So I've had people come in, especially baseball players that had shoulder injuries. They can't concentrically externally rotate the shoulder without pain. But what we have them doing is we have them overloading and using eccentric training methods. Nice and slow. And it's a great way to keep your athlete training through an injury, and it's going to help them. And again, like I said, I'm not giving you guys anything earth-shattering. A lot of you know all this already. So, let's go to the next one. So, eccentric testing technique. People say, well, do you test for eccentric? Well, one of the things you do is use common sense. You're probably testing concentrically, right? You want to know what the 1 RM is, right? And that 130% I said earlier, there's no magic to it, but that's probably more toward the max. All right? It's not inappropriate if you're going to use slow eccentric training to load at like 102, 105, start very small. Because obviously they're using a max. We want to make sure the connective tissue can handle it. But some of the other things you can do with some of the developmental athletes and athletes in general is you test them, and your eyes and your ears will tell you a lot. Okay? Don't let your eyes and ears deceive you because you're reading a scientific paper that says you should X, Y, and Z. So there's 3 real simple things you can do we use with our developmental athletes. One of them is a deceleration run. Okay? Because we're talking about transfer over to sporting rules. I'll have them line up in a line, get in a start position, an advantageous joint position. I'll have them run to another line, okay, and have them decelerate and stop. They have to stop in the same position they started out. And what you'll typically see is athletes overrunning the line. They try to break using their quadriceps, and they wind up doing this. Heels come off the ground. They come forward. If you see that, what's happening is the lower body and the quadriceps taking over, and there's a lot of shear forces on the knee when you see that. That's a braking action, but that's not the kind of braking action you want. A red flag should go up. You should say, wait a minute, there must be the hip extensors, especially the glutes, are not firing. They're not firing to the extent they need to fire. And that's where a lot of this eccentric training will come in. So a deceleration run will tell you a lot, especially if they can't decelerate. Start in this position, they run, they get back in this position, they can stop quickly. All right? And it doesn't have to be a long one. It can be 15 yards. It can even be 10 yards. All right? A box jump up. Now, I know a box jump up is concentric when you're going up, but it's the landing that I'm concerned about, the eccentric landing. What happens when they land? Do they land? Do they have a good solid base of support? Are they able to dampen the landing? Are they able to maintain good body posture and joint angles? Or when they land, is it real loud? Are they going up on their toes, and are they leaning forward? If you see that, okay, there's problems. They don't have good eccentric control. And I can't tell you how many times I see plyometrics being used with younger kids, and it's not that you can't use them with younger kids, because I mean jumping jacks and running through a ladder can be plyometric, low intensity. But if they can't jump up, you know, on like an 8 or 10 inch box and have good control at that level, then you've got problems. And you should have them trying to jump on higher boxes. They just don't have the control. And once they get the proper control, the landing mechanics will improve dramatically. Another thing is, what do you hear when they're doing the deceleration run and the box jump? If you hear high amplitudes, and you're just like, when I hear them running when they're taking off, if I hear boom, 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 boom on the ground, I know that they don't know how to deal with the forces that are being generated. They have very poor reactive strength. Okay, that spring in their step, very poor. It's very loud. When you hear those, that loud, you typically see this in cross-country runners. If they've been running distances for a long period of time, so is there any cross-country coaches out here? Anybody? Okay, what you'll notice, well, you may notice this. I notice it because the teams run in front of my place, and I always listen. And they sound like a herd of pregnant water buffaloes. They sound terrible. When I hear somebody that's really pounding the pavement like that, right away, bad eccentric control, weak hip extensors, weak tibialis anterior, all kinds of stuff going through my mind when I hear that. You do not want them running like that. And so this is where some of the fast eccentric training will come in. And then the last one is a squat. So I'll have Neo just demonstrate real quick. We're going to do a lot of stuff on squats. So we have, this is a box we use. It's a low box, okay? And one of the things you can do with anyone, okay, in your developmental athletes, if everyone can see, is just squat to the box. Say, I want you to squat to the box, and Do they have neuromuscular control as they get toward that disadvantageous joint range of motion? Do it one more time. Obviously, she does have good control. All right? Now, what you typically see when they don't have good control is they have good control during the advantageous joint ranges of motion, and then they collapse on the box when joint angles change and get towards 90 degrees or lower. When you see that, they do not have good eccentric control. They just don't. And you need to work on that. The good thing is with younger athletes, developmental athletes, that control comes fairly quick. All right, you're going to hear us talk about progressions on this. All right, we're moving now. Okay, I'm going to let Amanda take this slide.
All right, so slow eccentric training techniques. Let's take a look at the video on the left here. So notice this is me performing a bodyweight squat. Got a well-established base of support before I begin the movement. So my feet remain flat on the floor at all times. And then core is also well braced. So there's ideal torso shin angles, especially at that bottom, that lowest point of the squat. I'm also performing a full range of motion, but exhibiting a lot of control eccentrically as I descend to that lowest point into the really disadvantageous joint range of motion, right? So oftentimes you'll get untrained athletes or even just general clients come in and they have difficulties performing a squat with proper mechanics like that. So one way you can test for eccentric control and how to safely perform the squat is by doing a bodyweight box squat, like what we see on the right in what Neo just demonstrated. So when they're performing this, you want to make sure you're looking for those proper squat mechanics, but also are they able to control as they descend? So like Neo demonstrated before, if she collapses, then they have poor eccentric control, right? So if they perhaps kind of fail that test, right? So what are we going to do then? We're not going to train them in that really low box, right? We're going to use a different height of the box. So we like to use various heights of boxes, kind of meet them where they're at, train them in a less difficult range of motion. As they develop eccentric control, you can lower the box so that they can eventually advance to that full range of motion bodyweight squat where they can demonstrate really great eccentric control.
You. And talking about body weight first, so we're talking about progressions. So we always want to make sure we start unloaded. We always start with unloaded first and then loaded. All right. So that's progression. Slow to fast. You've got to demonstrate that you can perform the slow eccentric action under good neuromuscular control first before we can even think about moving to the fast. And then we want to go from simple to complex. And it's important that before you make something more technical, a little bit more complex, that you make sure they can demonstrate the neuromuscular control slow. Malia, take over here. Demonstrate the video.
Alright, so on this video on the left, I am demonstrating a split squat. I would just like to point out that I've already established my basic support before going into this slow eccentric action. Now on this video on the right, I'm demonstrating a lunge drop. I start in a squat stance, quickly reposition my foot into a split squat, and then reestablish my base of support before going into a fast eccentric motion.
And notice too on this, if you notice this video on the right, as she reestablishes her stance and drops, it's still controlled. That knee's not collapsing and hitting the ground. She's going just from, okay, a squat stance into a split squat stance and then descending quickly, with all under neuromuscular control. If you have any athletes come in, they're crashing into the ground, they have not established that neuromuscular control. Okay? Again, this is pretty easy, the progressions. I mean, body weight to loading, we know that. Okay, we know slow to fast, and we know simple to complex. But these drills where they are changing their stance and changing the base of support also really enhances movement skills, especially if you're talking about multi-directional athletes. It's good to do. some slow eccentric training techniques when you load. Some of my Olympic weightlifting friends. An overhead squat. Alright? And a controlled overhead squat. Alright? Now it doesn't have to be an overhead squat. You can load with kettlebells here, you can do other things, hold on to dumbbells. But this, again, if we're talking about going to something complex, that's pretty complex. Because your combined center of gravity now is over your head. Okay? You have to have adequate shoulder mobility, hip mobility, and whatnot. Now, if you notice, she's doing concentric and eccentric. But what I wanted to show you too is I can do it, believe it or not, I can do a whole presentation on the box squat alone. Not the West Side barbell version, okay? This is the body club. I know that name, Body Club. Just a quick story. I was in business for 4 years with a guy. He wanted out of the business when I first started, so I had 24 hours to come up with a new name for my corporation. Couldn't think of anything. I don't know how I came up with that name, but it sounds like some house of ill repute or something. In fact, I've had people call me over the years and ask me if this was a strip joint and what time we opened on Friday. I just had to say that. Anyway, on this demonstration here on the right, one of the things that a box squat is good for is, if you notice, she's not just squatting, but look at the shin angle as she squats there. The shin angle is more perpendicular to the floor here on the box squat than it is on the regular overhead squat. What the box squat allows you to do, it allows for a larger displacement of the hips backwards. Now why is that important? Because in order to stand back up concentrically, you now have to recruit more from the hip extensors, especially the glutes. So if you are having athletes that cannot recruit the glutes, or you tested them eccentrically, you're hearing that loud amplitude when they decelerate, they can't box squat very well, under control, all right? You can use a box squat and have them sit down and back. Emphasize the rearward displacement of the hips, because now you need greater recruitment from the hip extensors in order to stand up. It's a great remediation tool, and you can actually start out with a high box. If someone doesn't have control to yield to a low box, like Amanda said, meet them where they're at, get a box height that they can control their eccentric action. Then what you do is you start loading them. And then when they demonstrate control under a load, you lower the height of the box, and you repeat again. You start with body weight, then you start loading them. Then you lower the height of the box again, then you start with body weight, they can demonstrate good control, then you load them. And eventually, you can remediate some of that inactivity in the glutes. And I can't tell you how many times I see hip extensors, and I don't know if it's because athletes are sitting more, they're in front of the computer more, or whatever, but we're seeing more and more of it. I didn't bring it, but another technique we use to get rid of that glute amnesia, as I call it, we use something called a BFF. Is Ferguson here? Is Steve here? He's not. So, have you seen these? They're called electronic or electric foam rollers. Have you seen them? It looks like almost a car waxing buffer. Have you seen it? Has anyone seen them? I should have brought one. I'm telling you, it works. If you can get into the glute with that for 60 seconds, try it out. Have a kid squat on a box that can't demonstrate good eccentric control. Get that BFF out, blast the glute for 60 seconds, and then have them do it, and I'll be darned if they can't squat. It neurologically excites that muscle and turns it on when it's normally seen. Now, it won't last forever. You got to train it. It's got to be chronic. But it's just another thing that we've learned over the years that helps. This also helps with personal training clients too. I can't tell you, almost every personal training client, because we do both sports performance and personal training, that comes in our facility, almost every one of them has weak and amnesia glutes. Their glutes are weak, they can't fire properly. We use that technique and it really helps. So that's just a little extra we got there. Okay. Clean grip deadlift, so they're just taking an overhand pronated grip and she's just going down to the floor. Demonstrating eccentric control through the disadvantageous joint range motion. Again, nothing earth-shattering here. You've seen all these things before. All right. Okay, now, before you you start shuddering and say Olympic lifts, because some people, when I say that name, think, oh, Naso, he's an Olympic guy, so he's going to just brag about the Olympic lifts. Yes, I've been involved in the sport of Olympic lifting. Tom has, a lot of us have here. But I'm stepping outside of the Olympic lifting coaching, love for the sport, former competitor, all that, and I'm a coach now. I'm going to use tools that allow me to train my athletes. Even though I'm not trying to make them Olympic weightlifters, I'm not trying to make power lifters, I'm not trying to make them bodybuilders, I'm not trying to make them, MMA fighters, but I may take pieces of all of those things, put them in a program based on my athletes' needs, okay? And so, what I'm going to talk about today is fast eccentric training. And as far as I know, I've presented this one other time at a state clinic many years ago. And getting back to that, we don't make the products you use, we make the products you use better. This is where I'm going to go into some finer points that you may or may not have thought about before, about using Olympic lifts and variations of Olympic lifts, where we can still get the overload and all these other concepts I'm going to talk about. So I ask that you keep an open mind on this. Because some of you out there are kind of smirking like, I don't know, man, I just bench, squat, and deadlift, this Olympic stuff, I don't have the mobility. This is for your athletes and your clients, if it's not for you. Stop me anytime with questions, okay? Please. All right, this is where specificity really matters. This is specificity here. Okay, first of all, by show of hands, how many people use either the full Olympic lifts, the competition lifts, meaning squat snatch, squat clean, split jerk, or variations in your training personally or with athletes, raised by show of hands? Okay, so there's quite a few. So I think it's pretty well established that there's a carryover in a sports performance. Okay, why use these when we're talking about fast eccentrics? And by the way, I showed you some examples of body weight variations of fast eccentrics. And you could probably come up with a lot of them on your own. Somebody holding a kettlebell and drop it down into a squat real fast and decelerating at the bottom. But they allow for fast concentric actions, triple extension. We always talk about why do you perform the Olympic lifts. If I went around the room, everyone said, fast triple extension, instant muscle recruitment, tapping into the type 2A high threshold motor fibers, quick reaction time, first step quickness, all those things. Yes, 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 yes. But this is to talk about eccentric, not concentric, okay? All right? So, one of the things is when you perform an Olympic lift, if you perform the full lift, and I'm not talking about the power variations of the lift, like power clean, power snatch, power jerk. And by the way, just for clarification in case some of you don't know the difference, the full-on classic competition Olympic lifts are done by pulling off the floor, again, going into that disadvantageous joint range of motion, okay, getting full extension and then dropping all the way under, okay, if you're doing a clean or a snatch. That means you're dropping into the disadvantageous joint range of motion. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the power variation where you catch it here, at like 45 degrees or less range of motion. Because there are some very specific adaptations that are going to occur with the full lift range of motions and the variations of the full lift range of motions. So is everyone following me? Everyone on the same page? So I'm not talking about power clean, power snatch, power jerk. I'm talking about the full range of motion classical lift. Okay. The nice thing about Olympic lifting is you go from pulling something off the floor into a full-blown triple extension concentric action. And then when you move into the eccentric portion of the lift, you have to accommodate your own body weight and the external load of a heavy barbell or a barbell while you are repositioning your base of support, reestablishing your base of support, repositioning your stance, reestablishing your base of support with an external load. Now that is a lot different than putting a back squat, like you saw Brett earlier, on, taking a barbell, putting it on your back, and going slow into eccentric. There's no change of stance. There's no reestablishment of the base of support. But think about sports. When you're moving in sports, isn't there a change in your stance, base of support, and multi-directional movement? That's what we do, right? So if we're going to talk about specificity, you have to include when you're talking about fast eccentric actions, you have to include the Olympic lifts. You have to. The full classic Olympic lifts. And of course, this is just my opinion. I don't have the research because, like I told you earlier, most investigations are on slow eccentric actions. But they may provide a greater stimulus than body weight or plyometric type training. That's my opinion only. Why do I say that? Gets back to what me and Tom were talking about earlier. Because you have to generate and accommodate large forces. And if you're going to make somebody stronger and faster and more explosive, and by the way, unless you're talking about cross-country or some of the more aerobic-oriented sports, endurance sports, most of the sports that we train as strength and conditioning professionals are strength power sports, okay? So you have to include Olympic lifts in there at some point. You should, and you should consider it if you're not, or some type of power training. And I don't want to get ideological here because some people will say, I don't like the Olympic lifts, they're too hard and too technical to coach. Okay? I'll use my platform here to soapbox for just a minute. They are not hard to coach. If you can do a Romanian deadlift, you can do a front squat, and you can jump up on a box, and you can have adequate mobility in your shoulders to do that front squat, you can do an Olympic lift. You can do a full-on, provided there's no issues that need to be remediated. It's not hard. And I would suggest to everybody in here, if you have a tendency to shy away from the Olympic lifts because maybe you don't feel comfortable as a coach teaching them yet, or you think they're too technical or whatnot, get with somebody like Tom or me or someone that does this all the time. They're not hard to coach. They're not hard at all. Because I get that sometimes. They're really not. They're easy to coach. And the benefits you're going to get from the fast eccentrics as we go through this PowerPoint are enormous for your athletes. All right, also, this is one of the most important things. Performing the Olympic lifts trains the body to brake. The body has to eccentrically slow the movement down somewhat during the fast eccentric actions. It may look like a free fall after they rack the bar and they're heading down towards the bottom. And yes, they are using elastic stored energy in the connective tissue and muscle to come back up, but there is a significant amount of very fast eccentric work that occurs during the most extreme joint ranges of motion. So from an injury prevention standpoint, this is significant. But these adaptations only occur with full classic Olympic lifts. I want to emphasize that, not the power versions of the lifts. Okay, I just said that. There is a great deal of Olympic or of eccentric work performed during weightlifting training, but a lot of that comes from slow eccentric training or maybe not as fast by doing front squats and things like that. Although Olympic lifters perform their squats pretty fast. All right. Here's an important point that I want to make known to you, okay? And I'm going to explain this. The eccentric actions performed during the execution of the full classic Olympic lifts cannot be greater than a 1 rep max. I'm going to say that again. Eccentric actions performed during the full Olympic lifts, meaning squat snatch, squat clean, split jerk, cannot exceed your 1 RM. Now, why would that make sense? If I'm lifting a weight off the ground and I concentrically have to get the weight moving, whether it's snatch, okay, clean and jerk, I'm not going to be able to lift off the ground more than a 1 RM, right? So that means when I catch the bar and drop into that low squat position to finish the lift, I'm not going to have a stimulus greater than a 1 RM. So when you do the full classic Olympic lifts, you're not going to be able to use the eccentric overload principle, which allows you up to 130% more. Which is why I'm going to show you some variations of some things we've come up with over the years that allows you to do it and still gives you the benefit of the full ranges of motion. So that's an important thing. Is everybody following me on that? Did I explain that okay? Everybody good with that? All right. And here's where I get myself into trouble. There is a lack of research, okay, supporting the advantages of using the full lifts and the variations for eccentric training. because there's just, studies have not been done on fast eccentric training using the Olympic lifts. They're just not there. So I'm extrapolating from what I already know in the science, which is, let's take the specificity, right? If actions occur fast on the court or on the field, makes sense that we perform fast actions in training, right? Would anyone disagree with that? How about the overload principle? You have to generate big force to get stronger, to have increase in connective tissue, tensile strength, and to meet minimal essential strains so the bones get stronger, and also just to be able to create big force. No one would disagree with that, right? Okay. All right, now, what happens in the full classic Olympic lifts is there is, and I don't have them, this just shows the beginning of the eccentric phase of the movement. Okay, he's at full triple extension here, so he pulled this weight off the floor. There is a triple extension followed by triple flexion, let that sink in, and then a very fast deceleration. It's almost unnoticeable. So what I'm talking about here is, right here, he's pulled the weight off the floor. The barbell is at almost at its apex, as high as it's going to get. Now what has to happen is, the lifter has to reposition his feet. Notice the narrow stance that he pulled out of off the floor here, and notice the wider stance there. Coming up, repositioning his feet, going all the way down. Okay? So right here we have a demonstration of full triple extension for power. Then, after that, in order to reposition the feet as the barbell is moving up, he's pulling on the barbell, but he's actually flexing the hip flexors. It happens instantaneously. He has to flex the hip flexors to reposition his feet, and then once the bar is racked in and he's catching it in a low, disadvantageous joint range of motion, the deceleration has to occur very fast. Now, very few movements that are externally loaded to this magnitude have triple extension followed by triple flexion, okay, and then a fast deceleration. You're getting three components there of athletics that you could train, three qualities that you could train that are very important to athletic and movement in one full lift. Now, if you do the power clean or power snatch variation of this, yes, advantageous joint range of motion. And although you are getting some yield where you have to resist the bar and catch it, and even catch the oscillation, the adaptations that occur with full range of motion, disadvantageous joint range of motion, full Olympic lifts are different than the power versions of the lifts. Ma'am, you had a question?
Yes, in sports, often there's a rotary component. Do you train that eccentrically too, the rotary?
You can train it by, we use a med ball, concentrically throw the ball and then you catch it. Throw it hard and catch it, come back this way. So yes, I wouldn't do it with an Olympic lift just because of the torsion you put on the spine.
Right, no, you
But
have
yes,
to do a different
yes,
exercise. I'm just wondering if you
yes, very
addressed
good
a
question.
rotary.
Very good question, yes.
What was the
Usually
question?
med
What was the
ball.
question again? I don't
Oh, can you state the question again? Roland?
Oh, I just said that in sports there's a rotary component, and I was just wondering how he trained that.
Yes, she said there's a rotary component. You train eccentrically. Yes, med ball, throw against the wall. Here's another thing. The Olympic lift, they kind of get gigged for being just a single plane movement. Well, you're only moving in, the sagittal plane. You're only moving in one plane. Sports are multi-directional. So just performing the Olympic lift, I can tell you right now, if you don't think the Olympic lift has a carryover into sports, I could show you some of my previous Olympic lifters. They had the best sprints times, the highest vertical jumps, and they usually were the best athletes on the team. And I attributed a lot of it to the Olympic lifts because they weren't super, they weren't born with superstar parents. They were born pretty average genetics. So this idea that single plane movements can't transfer to multi-plane is nonsense because I don't just train the Olympic lifts. We use medicine balls, we do all kinds of stuff. We do movement training. So this is just a component of an overall program. So if you get too dogmatic about your, I even had, does anyone know who Tudor Bapa is? he wrote the books. He's kind of, they say he's the father of periodization. So many, many years ago, Tudor Pompa was presenting at an NSCA clinic. I can't even tell you the decade, it was so long ago. But he was there, and afterwards he came up to me and he goes, I know you. And I'm like, you don't know me. He goes, I know you. We drank wine together. I'm like, dude, I don't drink. I mean, I don't know you. So we started a conversation. He's a great guy. And I was talking to him about his lecture, and he goes, let me ask you a question. I said, yeah. He goes, do you like the Olympic list? I'm like, yeah, I'm a coach. I do. So he's like, oh, man. And he couldn't, he thought that, he's like, well, what about swimmers stuff? Would you be doing? I said, yeah, I would use them for swimmers. Why would you use them on a swimmer? I said, well, don't they have to do a block start? Isn't that triple extension? If they get in the water faster, isn't that going to cut down their time? He's kind of like, I mean, so you can't be so dogmatic about something, is what I'm saying. And I'm not trying to put him down too. He's great. He's awesome. He's in another stratosphere compared to where I'm at. So he's good. But I do want to emphasize, it's that extension, flexion, and then the deceleration. Nobody thinks about that we go from real fast extension to real fast flexion to eccentric, okay, deceleration. So literally you're going from hip extensors getting the work to hip flexors getting the work, and then eccentrically loading the extensors again through a full joint range of motion, okay? Here's another example, okay? This is a German lifter. He pulled it, he's snatching here. He pulled it off the floor, so he's a triple extension. Now notice how he's starting his descent. You can see his feet move slightly. They don't move as slightly as the last lifter, but they're a little wider. His feet are coming off the ground. He repositions his feet as he goes under, and he's all the way down into a low squat position, okay? Now, I have an article I wrote a few years back, and I'm going to pass out in a couple minutes here, but I didn't want to distract you. I don't want you reading it right away. I want you to go to a sequence that I have on the last page. This is one of the lifters from our club, and it's a sequence of him doing a clean. And I don't have my readers on it because I'm too old to see the letters. I can't read a super can anymore. But underneath there is an explanation of what's going on. And if you look particularly at some of these pictures, and I'll show you, you can kind of get an idea of what I'm saying. But to my knowledge, no one really talks about this. A real fast extension by a flexion and then dropping into an extreme range of motion. No one really talks about that, even though it's performed during the full lifts. How many people are doing mostly power versions of the lifts? Raise your hands. Okay, nothing wrong with them. They're good. They're good. And there's a time and place for that too. But adaptation. Remember, specific adaptation to imposed demands. You're going to get different adaptations doing the full lifts. All right, Neil. All right, so what are some of the fast eccentric training techniques? Here's some exercises we have. Oh, we're on time. Okay. So, she's doing a squat clean there on the left, and there's a drop squat. Okay? So, she can lift more than this, but if you notice here, she's using a lighter load to drop under, and using a heavier load to do a drop squat. So same thing, she reestablishes a new base of support, new foot positioning stance, and then drops under. Now, obviously I'm spotting it. So, remember what I said about the classic lifts. Your eccentric is always less than or equal to your 1 rep max. So you're limited when we're applying the overload principle, once your athletes get advanced, we're limited in just performing the classic Olympic lifts because now we can't load them any heavier than their 1 RM, right? So what we can do is use variations like a drop squat. So let's say somebody can only squat clean 40 kilos. They could probably drop squat 50 kilos fast, under control. And you can plug in whatever numbers you want. I'm just using that as an example, okay, for young athletes. So there's a variation. This one is always going to be less than or equal to a 1 RM. This can be greater than a concentric 1 RM. And you're moving through that full range of motion, that disadvantageous joint range of motion. All right, injury prevention. There's a lot of things you can do for that, but from an injury prevention standpoint, just like we showed the football players, whether you believe it or not, like I've heard people say, well, my athletes always start out in an athletic position. They're basketball players or they're linebackers in football. Well, think about what happens. Once I start to get low, because a running back's get low, I have to move through those disadvantageous joint range of motion. And I have to be able to yield and absorb and stop the tackler. I'm just using American football because we're almost at the Super Bowl. So there's it. From an injury prevention standpoint, if we just extrapolate and apply the principles of, you've heard it said before, train the muscles through the fullest joint range of motion possible that are, within safe limits. You don't want to exceed a normal joint range of motion, right? So doesn't it make sense to train fast through those ranges of motion? It does. But oftentimes we avoid that because we think there's safety concerns. And there is if the athlete's not physically prepared. But if you're doing your jobs right, the athlete is constantly adapting and getting a little bit better, a little stronger, changes are occurring over time, and you get to a point where you can use the overload. So you can do a snatch or a snatch balance. Again, classic Olympic lifting techniques. All right, Neil, go to the next one. All right, I'm going to let you take it.
Okay, so just what James have already stated, from a movement efficiency standpoint, so Olympic lifts have a great carryover to athletic performance. So the two positions that we're going to look at here is the squat clean and then the box jump. And the major reason why these Olympic lifts have that carryover to athletic performance is because we have that initiation of a start position of a jump. So if we look at this picture here first to the right, we have the squat clean. If we look at the ankles, the knees, and the hips, and then compare it with the box jump, ankles, knees, and the hips, we notice that these joint angles are very, very similar. So I'll go into the next slide, where we're actually going to play them. I just kind of,
That was a shot.
yeah, I got like 3 so far. Okay, so now we're both playing them. Let's start with the squat clean. So notice here that as we're coming up, we're talking about that triple extension once again. We have the ankles, the knees, and then the hips, followed by that fast triple flexion, just like James stated, and then we're decelerating into that eccentric portion. So this requires high levels of neuromuscular control and also high level of eccentric ability to not collapse into the floor, just like Malia showed with her drop, the drop squat and split squat. So that's that one. Now we're going to go over to the box jump. So while playing this video, we're also seeing that triple extension as we're coming up, fast flexion, and then decelerating by that eccentric portion. This one also has a lot of neuromuscular control and a high level of eccentric ability to be able to not fall off the box, or simply by placing my feet and making sure that I can land properly. Again, if we do a little at the end here, to the end face of the lift. Once again, notice the similar joint angles. Looking at the ankles, the knees, and the hips. Very, very similar. So, I got another one. So, why do we care about the fast eccentric lifts then? Well, James already stated, and it improves performance. So, while we improve that performance in the jumping and also the landing ability, we help the athletes to improve their performance, but also decreasing their injury rates. Oh, clicker doesn't work. Sorry about that. There we go. It also improves the linear, but also the multi-directional movement and deceleration aspect of sports. So many sports, soccer, basketball, football, softball, baseball, we're not moving in that linear, we're also moving in the multi-directional. So when we have that ability to decelerate, we decrease the injury risks. So while I played soccer, I had 2 ACL injuries, and both of those happened in the deceleration. That's when I tore my ACL. So it's very, very important to have that ability to decelerate. That's going to drastically decrease our injury rates. So if you guys remember the video that we showed earlier, maybe it makes more sense now. Look at that high neuromuscular control and the high level of eccentric ability he has in order to karate himself down and then come down,
Now notice he's not only doing that on 2 feet, he's actually eccentric loading on 1 leg, and then he's changing his direction as he's taking the ball going forward. So those are very, very important reasons why we would incorporate the Olympic lifts.
Now, I also want to say, depending on what study you're looking at, this has broad implications performing the full Olympic lifts for your female athletes. Huge. Neo got tore up before we knew her. Now she can do full range of motion. So depending on what study you're looking at, between 2.5 to 8 times more likely females are to have non-contact ACL injuries, depending on what studies you look at. But it's a much higher rate than men. And if you can have athletes moving through that disadvantageous joint range of motion, but doing it very fast, also having to accommodate a dynamic external load, plus the oscillation of the barbell. If you're using it, that's why we only use real Olympic bars. But there is a difference between using real Olympic bars that are made out of metals that actually oscillate and flex. They give you more whip off the floor, and plus, when you catch them, either overhead or at the shoulders, depending on what lift you're doing, they oscillate. And that oscillation, it actually causes an enhanced training adaptation. Because now you got the oscillation of a heavy, externally loaded barbell that you have to decelerate and then move with. Does that make sense? So this is an excellent, the Olympic lift variations are excellent for female athletes. Go back to that, the drop squat, because that's a real good one, where you reestablish your stance, you drop down. That's a real good exercise. Obviously, you've gone through the progressions, body weight to external loading, slow to fast, simple to complex, before you get to the point, but where you're doing like a drop squat. So I stand behind, I just squat, and you start here, and boom, And I don't know if you can see the bar oscillating a little bit or not, but it does. You see that little oscillation? That actually enhances the training effect, and those are things people don't think about. They just think, well, I just have a bar. Well, if you have a real stiff Texas power bar, okay, and the bar's not oscillating, it's not going to have the same effect as a bar that oscillates. So just little things, little tiny things can make a difference. Another thing that I'll do sometimes with more advanced athletes is I'll load the bar in reverse. And what I mean by that is I'll put the lighter plates on the inside of the bar, and I'll load the heavier plates to the outside, causing even more oscillation on the bar when I do it. And that's believe it or not, that's an advanced technique. And you can use that even on, if you wanted to do stuff with your, people who need pressing strength, you could get a regular Olympic weightlifting bar, have them do bench presses, have them come down, let the bar oscillate. That'll give you another training. Even though it's a slow eccentric, it'll oscillate a little bit. It's another adaptation that you can force out of the movement. And I'm all for getting as much bang for your buck, because like we said, we don't have a lot of time to work with our athletes anymore. I used to have a determined 12 to 16 week off period, and now I don't even get them that long. So I don't really know sometimes what I do. So let me ask you guys a question. How can we really use periodization, classical periodization techniques, when we don't have them for very long? I mean, to be honest with you, we can't really, unless we have an athlete that's coming in, he's going to do like the NFL Combine or something, we put him on a long training cycle. I can't use periodization. And so there's no such thing as going through, the anatomical adaptation phase, the hypertrophy phase, this phase. I got to find out what this kid's abilities are, work on their weak points, and get them doing stuff right away. There's really no, I mean, I cycle the intensities, but that's different than following the classic model. Are you guys seeing that too? You seeing that? Anyone want to share some? Tom, you see that?
Yeah,
What you got in school?
26 years, I can't figure out how to make it work, so just try to do as least amount of damage as I can. So, but they're training, like you said, they train year round in a certain sport, which damages a lot of their other athleticism. If I see a kid who's been specializing in baseball since 8 years old, they're not really very good athletes unless they're gifted genetically. It's just, and I don't know why anyone will let that happen as a parent. I don't know.
I had an athlete that was a tennis player. If I put a tennis racket in his hand, he could move real good laterally. But if I had him doing anything with speed or power, then couldn't do it very well. And you're not seeing the balance you see. Are other people seeing that too? You're seeing a lot of imbalances, yes ma'am?
Yeah, I'm an athletic trainer and a CSCS, and
Okay.
the first thing I do with my athletes when they come in, because I work more in the strength and conditioning side of things, I use my orthopedic evaluation skills, and I do full manual muscle testing on all my athletes. So I basically map out, I can see weakness in internal and external rotation, your abductor weakness, extension, quadricep, hamstring. I go through everything, ankle inversion, knee version, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, through the gamut, including upper extremity as well. These guys have the weakest abductors because every time you strike a soccer ball through flexion of the hip, you're actually internally rotating your femur to get that curve on the ball. These guys can hardly do lateral slides with a band. And I get them on the table, I'm like, all right, resist the motion. They can hardly resist against me pressing them to the table, and their eyes open up, they're like, what the heck, I'm a Division I soccer player, like, how are you, like, just, like, skinny lady, like, keeping me from keeping my leg up, And it's a great tool to use, so if you have a way to, like, to learn manual muscle testing, you're not doing anything that's, like, outside of your scope of practice when you're just testing, can they resist me or not, and once you learn the technique of it, it's amazing, the roadmap, and that's where I found like so much success with everyone. Because whether you have a torn ACL, whether you have meniscal tears, whether you have, labral problems in your hips, glenohumeral joint slap lesions, it doesn't really matter what is the reason for the injury. What we need to do as strength coaches is to fix where our weaknesses are. So like creating that roadmap with the manual muscle testing has been a phenomenal tool, and I encourage everybody to, to learn about it and maybe put it into practice.
Would you agree, and I think this tails off what Tom said, that playing sports causes imbalances? Think about it. Train a hockey player. Train a hockey player. You talk about external rotation. I mean, so the sport kind of dictates what muscles get used. A lot of times, one time they brought me into the university, they wanted me to train the tennis team, and I did some testing and stuff. We have a little bit different testing, but if you think about the serve, it's one of the fastest actions, maybe next to the snatch in Olympic weightlifting and sport. And you're always serving, Well, think about the muscles involved in serving. What functional kinesiology will tell you, will determine what muscles are used during the sporting action and train those muscles, whatnot. What about the antagonists? What about the deceleration muscles that are getting overused? And so sometimes by just training the muscles that are weaker, the imbalance, like you said, improves the performance of the sport, and you don't even have to get into the other stuff that we classically would get into as strength coaches. So would you agree with that statement? Would that be accurate?
Absolutely. Like that's the first thing that I do is I identify, what's going on. I mean, because the other thing too is being like sports medicine clinician, like my ability to like just visually, I'll just watch an athlete walking into the gym, and I'm evaluating them before they even shake my hand and introduce themselves. And I'm like, he has Trendelenburg syndrome. I like doing spine rotation there instead of getting full hip extension. Definitely has like chronically tight hip flexors. Like my brain, I'm probably anybody that I see walk in front of me, I'm always muttering under my breath like they're in, ready for a total hip in 2 years. I can just see the way people move. So like that, I mean, it absolutely like the ability for them to change directions. You have these soccer guys with the tight adductors, really strong internal rotation and adduction. They're weak external rotation and abduction. Well, to change direction side to side, when you get that strong, those guys are getting quicker on the field than they've ever felt before. And they're like, how is this possible? And you're opening up their joints, they're not having the impingement in their hips.
And you're also, it's restoration recovery.
Right. It's preventative medicine, it's rehabilitative medicine, it's all of those things wrapped into one.
That seems where strength and conditioning is actually kind of going.
It is going in that
Because
direction. I was just going to ask that
In
question.
10 years, I've been tracking how many kids have actually, now I only use doctor's documentation if they went to the doctor or they had physical therapy. It's gone up 250-ish% in 10 years of injuries.
Yes.
So they're coming in, here's my doctor's note, okay, here's my physical therapy. So in one of my classes I had, out of 42 kids, I had, what was this, like 3 years before COVID, 6 kids with things going on. And
Yeah.
cheerleading is like a huge perpetrator.
Because you see kids,
They get injured just all the time, just
And you see
massive.
hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids, and that's, Tom brought up a good point. I was going to ask the question, where do you guys see the profession moving? Because I find myself doing more and more testing and evaluating and working on remediation because they're so broken when they come in. I'm finding myself, what am I? Am I a physical therapist? Well, no, not by trade, but I'm getting the hospital physical therapist calling me up and saying, he's been released, or she's been released. I had a female soccer player come in a couple years ago. I did a simple jump test, a single leg jump. I mean, horrible. Was not totally not ready, totally unstable. She was another ACL waiting to happen. I called up the physical. I said, "What do you mean she's cleared? She's not. She's failing my basic initial test." And they said, "Well, she's out of insurance." So being cleared by your medical profession does not necessarily mean that they are physically. So I'm just saying from a liability standpoint, because I'm an expert witness in the field. They hire me to go to court cases and analyze stuff and do depositions and all stuff. I can just tell you from a liability standpoint, if you get that client coming in that the doctor releases, you make sure you document that you called them back and you said this person's really not ready, they need this and that, because otherwise you're going to open yourself up to a lot of heartache in the legal system. But yeah, so what are we? We need to become more diversified. Testing and evaluating really is coming to the forefront now more than ever. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say, I'm a physical therapist.
There you go.
So CSCS, and like, we love working with CSCS, personal trainers, all that stuff, so we really love communicating with you guys afterwards, because it's true, like, insurance cuts you off real fast. And then just to back to manual muscle testing, if you can learn how to do that, that's even helpful. And also, Illinois is a direct access state now too, so we're getting people, people think, I think, a lot of times we rehab after surgery. I barely see post-op anymore. I see almost all muscle imbalance issues. So anytime you can work with the CSCSs and PTs can work together and personal trainers, that's awesome. So
Yeah, we should try to work together. Michelle.
So I would just throw in there, because I'm on the business side of things, right? So I'm a little, please, already smiling. I'm on the outside of things, I know, in here. I would just say that's a really organic, sincere, true, beautiful way to grow your businesses, right? If you really care about your athletes, you care about keeping them as injury-free as possible with all these things up against them, but you establish relationships with physical therapists who are in a bind because the insurance has run out, so they can't take care of this client patient anymore, but they know they can trust you to send them to keep them safe and keep going with their healing and recovery. It's a very sincere, most of us hate sales, it's a very sincere, great way to establish those relationships, and it's a two-way street too, because then when you get athletes and clients that are out of your scope, you have someone you trust that you can send them to, and it helps the athlete and the business feeling like you have to get sales in your one-to-one on your side, helping them keep your goals.
I'm sure you're going to have more for us later. I know. Yes, sir.
I think the same principles apply to the general public that has hip replacement or knee or shoulders, whatever it is. They're not rehabbed when I get them. Just their insurance said, that's it. You get this many and no more. But, so I get them, and I have worked with physical therapy companies that send me
Oh, that's good.
because they know. But it also depends on, can the client pay for me?
Right.
Now they don't.
It's
I mean, I'm
cash
a lot
pay.
less than physical therapy costs, but still, can they afford it?
And the compliance issue too, when they're cut loose.
Yeah.
99% of the time, they're not doing what they have to do as consistently as they should. Yeah, so, yeah, it's an interesting field. I've seen it change dramatically over 40 years, yes.
Yeah, going back to what you were teaching in the slides real quick, in your experience, at what point, age-wise, or it could be experience-wise too, training age, for instance, when would you start incorporating some of the heavier eccentric loading?
A lot of it depends on their training age, like you said, and what they've been doing up to that point. If I get someone that's raw that's coming in, I mean, we start sometimes with kids as young as 7 and 8 years old. And so when we get them that raw, obviously, we're looking for technique, we're looking for body weight control, whatever. But, a child's body will adapt neuromuscularly to externally loading just like an adult. It's just, like I showed you earlier on the one slide, they may have a mechanism that doesn't allow them real good eccentric control under heavy loads, but you got to load them fairly heavy to get to that point. They adapt just like, and they don't have the hormones yet. They don't have, you have to worry about increasing cross-sectional area. It's just a strength thing. They will consistently gain strength. I always like to see them before we get into the fast loaded eccentrics, I like to see them at least, and when I say, I'm talking about the heavier loaded eccentrics, when you're getting over 100% of a concentric 1 RM, I mean, I want to see them at least squat with double body weight, okay? And that's going to take a while. You're not going to have a little guy doing that. But once they demonstrate good control, you can put, you know, a 10-pound weight vest on them, have them go into the box, maybe do, you know, reposition their feet like Malia had in her video where they have to change, you know, their stance and their base of support and control. And you can do it very minimally. And, you know, you guys are the best, you know, at observing your athletes. Progress them just like you normally would. You know, there's no magic number. Like I have some kids that come in that are more developed than other kids and they're the same age. Like I got a 12-year-old come in and he looks like he's a 16-year-old. He's muscular or whatever. And then you get, you know, another guy coming in the same age and he looks like he's 8. He's not developed. So obviously they're going to be on different levels, you know. But I think that the most important thing is the progression scheme. We want to go from body weight then to loading. Okay, they have to demonstrate the control. We always want to do, you know, simple to complex. Don't make it, because if they can't do it in a, you know, with a fixed base of support, fixed stance, they're not going to be able to change their stance. You know, those are important principles. Simple to complex. You know, unloaded to loaded. What's the other one I'm forgetting? I'm forgetting one of them. Fast, slow to fast. Jeez, brain dead here. Slow to fast. I'm talking about fast, but. I mean, and another thing you can do is just demonstrate, can they get in a position? I'll have them get in an athletic position and I'll just prod and push on them. You know, can they maintain this position? If I come over to them from the side and just go like that and they fall over, I mean, it's really easy to tell if a kid's weak, you know, and you can usually tell who the stronger kids are, they stick out. But as you progress, I mean, if you're a D1 strength coach here, I'm assuming you've got some elite athletes, there's adaptation that occurred. You can probably progress fairly quickly to loaded, you know, fast eccentrics fairly quickly. But do the same thing. Test them with body weight because there's a lot of high-level athletes that have imbalances, like our athletic trainer friend here told us, and you have to be able to identify. Sometimes the people at the elite level they demonstrate some of the worst imbalances because they've been playing their sport a long time. So never underestimate, you know, the level of athlete you're working with. And here's another thing. I learned this from your health and meal. If you deal with elite athletes, Division I or higher, a lot of those athletes that are strength power athletes, they pick the right parents. They have good genetics. They're naturally explosive. Some of them are going to walk into your weight rooms and gyms, and what's going to happen is they're going to demonstrate very high abilities to create force and do heavy lifts. But you'd be surprised how many of them have a very young training age. And the reason I'm telling you this is they have the genetics and the ability to generate high forces with their muscles, but the connective tissues and the bones and their neuromuscular system is not matched their ability to create force. And those are the ones you have to be real careful with. So always find out how much training they've done in the past. What's your training age, your biological age. Find out what they've experienced. They might come from a program that did all Olympic lifts, and you're going to be lucky because they're going to be pretty athletic. They might come from a program that the high school was so small and so poor, all they had was, you know, a universal machine. Remember those old universal machines? I'm dating myself. You know, you just don't know what you're dealing with. So, and they could be naturally athletic. So be careful. And if they can take 80% of a 1 RM, they said they've never really worked out before, and they're handling those loads fairly easy, and they can move fairly quick. That's going to tell you something. Hey, this guy, I got something here. 80, 85%, I got something here. You know, and they've never touched much of a weight. You know, and they can do it fairly easy, and they pick up and they're coachable. Just be careful with those athletes because they can get injured. So let me run through the rest of this. I know we got a little bit of extra time, but I don't want to hog. So. What goes up must come down. Shane Hammond, 350 pounds. He can jump. Okay? We know that athletes that have a high amount of relative strength are usually lighter athletes, right? Bigger athletes, heavier athletes, they have a lot of absolute strength, but not a lot of relative strength. That guy can jump. Okay? That's during an actual competition at the Olympics, okay? These guys can jump. Don't tell me that this doesn't have transfer to sport performance. Not that you told me that, but there's always something on that. All right, just remember program. Test and evaluate what you see, what you hear. Use some of those tests that I talked about. What are the athlete's needs and training goals? Those are important, okay? Do they need just start out just with general strength, or can we start with the eccentrics, deceleration, landing? Prioritize your exercises based on who you're working with, what's appropriate, just like your question earlier. You know, when should I start loading externally? When should I go from slow to fast? Always with young athletes, beginners, slow before fast. Always slow before fast. They'll fool you. They'll fool you. They may look real good doing a squat, and then you add a little bit of speed, and all of a sudden they're all over the place. They look like a newborn fawn, you know. Be careful with them. Exercise order, okay? Keep going. Where am I going to place these in the program, in the cycle? Just remember, heavy eccentrics, if you use the overload principle, 100+% of a concentric, 1 RM, that's for the off season where they have lots of adequate recovery because they're going to be sore. Okay? Always assign intensity, okay? Make sure your body weight demonstration before externally load. I know I keep hitting that over the head, but I don't want someone going home going, hey kid, let's do a drop squat. You know? No, that's not good if you're loading. Okay, assign your volume recovery. These are all things you guys know from exercise science and programming. I don't have to go over all this stuff. Implement and adjust. Good strength coaches and strength conditioning professionals will implement something. If it's not working, they will analyze what's not working and change it. Do not be afraid to change. You don't have to do things exactly like I do them. Okay? Maybe you determine that 105% of a fast eccentric is plenty for my athletes. That's fine. Maybe you determine that we have to go through 6 months of body weight, complex fast eccentrics before you progress to more advanced loading. That's okay. You know your athletes better than I do. I'm just telling you what I do with my athletes. For our recommendations, we don't do high rep stuff when we're talking about eccentrics, especially if you're using the overload or greater than concentric. 1 to 5 reps is plenty. Okay? Classic Olympic lifts, 100% of concentric 1 RM going through the fullest range of motion, moving through that disadvantageous joint range of motion. You can use variations, okay, 5 to 20% more than a concentric 1 RM depending on the exercise. I was conservative on that. Instead of 130%, 105 to 120, probably for those externally loaded Olympic lifts. Slow eccentrics, 3 to 12 reps. Now 12 is high. 12 is high, but I'm talking about lighter loads for younger athletes. Okay, that's just to keep them under tension, get some hypertrophy, get a little bit of connective tissue adaptation. And then that number 130, there's nothing magic about it, but I pulled that out of somewhere that they did research. I think 130% over 1 RM is a lot. Okay, I don't think we need to be going crazy. All right. And then sets vary on need. Obviously, control your volume. These are not high volume stuff. You saw the slide earlier where a lot of muscular damage, the eccentric, especially the loaded ones. Okay, one of my last slides. It doesn't matter or does it? Okay, it does matter. What you do, how you program, how you train, and using your brain matters. I was at an NSCA-National conference many years ago, and I was in one room giving a presentation with my good friend Mike Waller, who, by the way, I have to give credit for the first 2 slides. Sorry about that. I should have done that earlier. My good buddy, he was a former NSCA, Illinois State Director, Mike Waller. Good guy. Sorry about that, Mike. He's not here. I was at this conference. Me and Mike were actually doing a presentation together, and in the next room was another guy doing a presentation, and we had sat in on this guy's presentation earlier, and basically the gist of his presentation was, it doesn't matter what the quality of the movement is, as long as they finish where you want them to, it doesn't matter. I was sitting next to a couple of physical therapists, they were cringing. This guy, he had a video of a guy on a retaining wall on a beach, and the retaining wall was probably 4 or 5 feet, and he was doing a depth jump off of it, okay, onto the sand in bare feet, okay, maybe. So he's up there, he's dropping, he drops, balanced knees, forward lean, heels coming up, I mean, just classic poor mechanics. And he said, doesn't matter how they land, doesn't matter, all that matters is he wasn't injured and he was able to do it. And I said to myself, and this guy is teaching at a national conference. That's just, to me, irresponsible. So it does matter. The stuff you learn does matter. I'm not preaching to you, I'm just saying, take in what you can use and do it. So, does anyone know, my two olders, does anyone know who that is? The Mackenzie brothers, have you seen that movie, have you? Okay. What's it called, like? Slow Brew?
Strange Brew.
Strange Brew, yeah, okay, I'm old. Okay. Slow or fast, you decide. You decide when to use it, you decide how to use it, you decide what's appropriate with your athlete. So, I hope you guys were able to take a few things to use and put them in your toolbox today. So, any more questions on anything? Can I be of any help? Yes.
So when I was raised in training Olympic lifting, the heavier the bar gets, the lower you have to drop to catch it. So I think it was really interesting how you went over purposely getting low in that full range of motion, even after you catch the bar. Like you jump, and when I was talking jump, and when you catch, you're done moving, and then you stand up.
If you can.
Yeah.
But if you're doing like 130% of a eccentric 1RM, you're going down.
Yeah.
And you have to break. But there is something to be said too about using lighter loads and going through the full range of motion and catching it low. Because catching it low is actually, I think Tom would probably agree with me, it's a skill. You got to learn to catch it low. Because people don't always want to go low. It's hard.
Well, the heavier the weight gets, you know,
Yeah,
they
you
have
have
to use mechanical advantages in
the
order
bar
to
is
come
the
up
most
with the bar anyway, so.
Yeah, but it's a good question. One thing, that article I gave you, I wrote, I should have put it in like Training and Conditioning Journal, but I put it in an actual Olympic weightlifting magazine. I'm not sure that the coaches really got a lot out of it, but I think you will. Notice on the last page, if you look at the sequence, notice the last page. I know it's small text, and I wish I could read it to you, but I can't. There's a sequence of a clean. That's Brett, you know Brett, one of our lifters in our club. It kind of gives you a sequence. If you read through that article, it kind of talks about the advantageous, disadvantageous joint ranges of motion. It talks about the value for athleticism. I really think there's some good things in that short article. So that sequence in particular is good. On the first page, though, there is an error on the first page, and I want to make sure. Oh, let's see if I can find it. Neil, I might need your eyes here. It is. Right, where it says the, oh no, sorry, second page. It says, where it says, it should say disadvantageous instead of, it says advantageous in parentheses somewhere under where?
Oh, under the picture, fourth sentence.
Okay, so yeah, so the fourth, under the picture, the fourth sentence where it says disadvantageous, cross that out, the dis, it should be advantageous. Okay? It should be advantageous on this. What's that? Yeah, did everyone get one, or do you need anyone need an article? Everyone got one? Okay, that's the wisdom I'm imparting for today.
Questions, James?
Thank you guys. Oh,